I'm Winifred Winnie Evans, and I was 68 this spring. I found the envelope that turned my life upside down. It was sitting on the kitchen table, half hidden under a pile of utility bills, white with a blue bank logo. Nothing unusual about it. At first, I'd finished my coffee, thinking about how quiet the house had gotten since Harold passed, and reached for it out of habit. I never expected that letter to hold more power over me than any storm or argument or loss before it. But that morning, as sunlight crept through the lace curtains, I opened it with steady hands and a heartbeat that wasn't so steady. By the time I finished reading, I knew everything was about to change before I go any further. Let me know in the comments if you've ever opened a letter that made your heart skip, and don't forget to subscribe if you believe everyone deserves dignity, no matter their age. I was born and raised in Ohio, daughter of a machinist and a Sunday school teacher. Back when kindness was as important as the clothes you wore to church, we didn't have much, but our home was neat, and we had a garden that fed us well. My father taught me that integrity meant keeping your promises even when it hurt, and my mother showed me how to bake bread, patch a shirt, and stand quietly by those you love. When Harold Evans proposed, he promised nothing fancy, just a little place where we could grow old together. We bought our house on Elm Street when I was 26, a 3-bedroom brick ranch with azaleas blooming by the front steps. I painted the kitchen myself, raised 2 children, Harper and Lennox, and never once thought I'd move again. Life after Harold was quieter, a slow drift into routines, but I was grateful for the peace. At first, the children visited when they could holidays, mostly sometimes birthdays. I tried not to notice how their voices had changed. A touch impatient now, or how often they reminded me that the house was too much for one person. But I kept the yard tidy, tended Harold's roses, paid every bill on time, and found small comfort in old habits that had carried me through tougher years. That morning, the letter from Fairview National Bank said I was 2 months behind on a mortgage payment for nearly $1 million. The sum was so outlandish, I reread it 3 times. Sure, it was a mistake. I'd paid off our mortgage decades ago. I never borrowed more than I could settle with my grocery money. I called the number on the letter, waiting through long silences and tinny music. And when a young woman answered, I tried to explain as clearly as I could that I hadn't taken out any new loans. She insisted the paperwork was in order. My name and social security number matched. The signature was mine. I listened, holding the phone with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking as she told me to come in, bring identification, and settle my debt before foreclosure began. I hung up and looked out the kitchen window, the spring rain falling steady on the driveway. I thought about Harper, my oldest, always so sharp, and Lennox, who called once a month to see if I needed anything. Harper texted me a reminder that Zoe's birthday dinner was at 3, a polite request not to wear my gardening sweater this time. I wrapped the silver bracelet I'd picked out for Zoe, combed my hair twice, and tried to act as if nothing was wrong. The Golden Lily restaurant was as noisy and expensive as I remembered, filled with people I barely recognized. Now my son was already there, crisp and polished. His wife Deirdre and their teenagers lost in their phones. Harper arrived late, all brisk apologies, her new SUV parked out front. Zoe barely glanced at the bracelet before turning away, and Harper whispered sharply, "For me not to mention the loan nonsense in front of everyone." I smiled through the meals, letting their words wash over me, but my mind kept circling back to the house. The letter, the threat, I couldn't shake afterwards. Harper promised to come by, sort everything out, and drove away in her spotless new car. I walked home alone, the bracelet box still in my purse, the kitchen light glowing through the front window. I stood at the sink, listening to the tick of the clock, and realized the home I'd tended for 40 years suddenly felt unfamiliar. And as I waited for Harper to arrive, I pulled out my old notebook, the one where Harold used to jot down numbers, and found the name of an attorney I'd never thought I'd need. I watched the rain run down the window glass, the feeling settling over me that something was shifting, something that would never shift back. When Harper finally pulled up to the house that evening, her new SUV parked in the driveway where Harold's old pickup used to stand. She came in without taking off her coat, eyes darting from room to room like she was searching for a way out. She asked for the bank letter, took it from my hands, and read through it so quickly I could see her knuckles turning white. "It's a mistake," she said, forcing a smile, but the tremor in her voice gave her away. I told her I'd already looked up the property on Lakeview Terrace and seen the photos, a house with shining glass windows and a view of the water. Nothing like the home we'd built our lives in. Harper bristled, insisting she would handle it, but her words didn't ring true. I told her someone had stolen my information and put my whole life at risk. Her face tightened, her voice rising as she told me not to call the police, not to make a fuss, and to let her sort it out. But as she grabbed the letter and rushed out the front door, slammed so hard it rattled the frame. I stood in the living room, staring at the space she'd left behind, and I realized the distance between us was wider than it had ever been. With the evening growing darker, I sat at my computer and opened the email from the bank. Attached was a digital copy of the loan agreement, my name scrawled at the bottom, the signature barely resembling my own. The forgery was so poor, I wondered how anyone at the bank could have accepted it. That small detail, the slipshod handwriting, the misspelled middle name, made the whole thing feel both absurd and unbearably real. I wrote down the name of the attorney I'd found in the city directory, someone who specialized in elder law, and called first thing the next morning. The receptionist answered on the second ring, asked a few polite questions, and set an appointment for that afternoon. At 2:10, I walked up the stone steps of the brick office building, smoothed the collar of my dress, and told myself that whatever came next, I had to face it. Inside the lawyer's office was filled with sunlight and green plants, not the intimidating walls of law books I expected. Rowan Jett greeted me by name, her handshake brisk but kind. She listened as I told my story, how the letter arrived, what the bank said, Harper's strange new car, the pictures of the house, the arguments, the disbelief. Rowan asked careful questions, making notes, never hurrying me. When I finished, she explained what she saw, a classic case of financial abuse made worse because the person behind it was family. She said my options were limited: file a police report and start a criminal case, bring a civil suit to have the loan voided, or try to resolve it quietly, though the last would mean confronting Harper directly. All three paths sounded harsh, and none felt like something a mother should have to choose. I asked Rowan what she would do in my place, but she only said every person must weigh what matters most, family or justice. On my way home, the clouds broke, and a soft drizzle started, the kind that makes the world look cleaner, but leaves you feeling colder than before. I tried calling Linux, hoping maybe my son would see the problem for what it was. Instead, he brushed me off, said Harper was paying the loan, and there was nothing for me to worry about, that it's just a family arrangement. When I pressed him, he grew short, impatient, and for a moment I heard the same tone in his voice that I'd heard from his sister, like I was a nuisance to be managed. I asked him outright if he'd known what Harper was doing, and after a pause, he claimed not to know the details. He asked me to trust them to avoid causing a scandal to keep things in the family. But there was no comfort in his words, only a reminder that for years I'd been expected to accept whatever my children decided, whether it made sense or not. At home, I sat at the kitchen table and called Audrey Flint. Audrey had worked with me at the post office years ago, and though we didn't talk as often as we used to, she was someone I could trust. She listened quietly, then told me not to let Harper get away with it. That loving your children sometimes meant letting them face the consequences. I thought about that through the night as the rain picked up, tapping out a rhythm on the glass, steady and patient. I wondered what Harold would have made of all this. He had always said a person's dignity mattered, that justice wasn't just about the law, but about self-respect. In the end, I called Rowan back and told her I was ready to move forward. We'd file the suit, and if it meant losing my family, at least, I'd be able to live with myself. The next morning, I returned to Rowan's office. We worked through the timeline, collected what evidence I could provide, and began the process of requesting medical records to prove I was at the doctor's office the day the loan was signed. Rowan took copies of my driver's license and passport, explained how we'd seek a handwriting expert to examine the signature, and drafted a formal request to the bank for all records of the transaction. With each step, the facts fell into place, and so did the realization that Harper had gone to great lengths to cover her tracks. She'd registered the house under a shell company, arranged for payments through corporate accounts, and called in favors with an old acquaintance at the bank, a loan officer named Tyler Pratt, who it turned out had gone to college with Harper years before. While Rowan pursued the official paperwork, I tried to hold on to my routines. I baked bread, swept the porch, watered the flowers by the front walk. The children didn't call. The silence from Harper and Lennox stretched out for days. The only voices in the house were mine and the old clock in the hallway. I reminded myself that waiting is part of every hard season, even if it feels endless. On the fourth day, Rowan called to say she'd gotten a lead from a realtor friend. The house on Lakeview Terrace wasn't listed under Harper's name, but under Caldwell Holdings, an LLC set up by Harper's husband Frank. The payments on the mortgage came from the company's account. Rowan handed me a copy of the loan agreement. The signature was nothing like mine, and she pointed out the loan officer who'd approved it. It wasn't just identity theft. It was a scheme carefully built and hidden behind paperwork and false signatures. I asked Rowan about Lennox's role. There was nothing direct, no documents, no checks in his name, but plenty of signs he'd known more than he admitted. In the middle of all this, Rowan received a call from the clinic. My alibi was confirmed. On the day the loan papers were signed, I'd been at St. Elizabeth's from 8:30 until almost 4 in the afternoon. We finally had proof. As I left Rowan's office, I passed a mother and her grown daughter, laughing together, in the cafe across the street. For a moment, I wished things had been different between me and my children. I remembered reading bedtime stories, making birthday cakes, patching knees and elbows, hoping that kindness and patience would be enough. Now, I was building a case against my own daughter and wondering if either of us would ever understand how we'd ended up here. That night, Harper left 3 messages on my machine. First angry, then pleading, then quiet, asking me to call her back to make it right. I didn't return the call. Whatever explanations she offered, nothing could undo what had already been done. I poured a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the rain taper off. The street outside was silent, except for the occasional car headlights sweeping across the empty yard. I knew the days ahead would not be easy, but I also knew there was no going back. The days that followed blurred together in a kind of quiet ache. I kept to my routines, moving from room to room, as if the stillness might settle my nerves. The house seemed emptier than usual, every photograph and worn armchair quietly reminding me of how far we'd all drifted. I tried not to linger over the old family pictures in the hallway, but sometimes I'd find myself standing in front of them, staring at Harper's smile as a little girl, Lennox's hand in Harold's, and I'd have to remind myself to keep moving. Outside, the weather turned cold and gray, the kind of late spring that keeps you inside, listening to the furnace rumble in the background. I called Audrey most evenings just to hear a friendly voice. She'd tell me about her volunteer work at the animal shelter, how the kittens kept escaping the playroom, or how the garden club was already arguing about the flower show. Her laughter made the house feel a little less empty, even if only for a while. Still, once the calls ended and the lights were off, the silence grew heavy again. Rowan checked in as promised, her tone always steady, never rushed. She updated me about the paperwork, told me about the progress with the bank, the next steps in our case. She asked for details, encouraged me to keep any records or letters I received. We talked about signatures, medical records, alibis. With each new document she collected, the story seemed less and less like a misunderstanding, and more like a wound that would take time to heal. One evening, as I cleared the dinner dishes, I heard a car slow outside. I looked through the blinds and saw Harper's SUV. She sat there for a long time, engine running, her face washed in blue light from her phone. She didn't come in. After a few minutes, she drove away without even looking at the house. I washed the last plate and put it back on the shelf, trying not to wonder what she'd hoped to find. The phone rang less often, and when it did, it was usually someone from the bank or a lawyer confirming some small fact. Neighbors waved from the sidewalk, but nobody lingered at the gate. Word gets around in a small town, and though no one said anything directly, I could feel a subtle change in the way folks looked at me at the grocery store, at church, as if they were waiting to see which side of the story I'd tell. Lennox's calls grew shorter. When he did phone, his voice was clipped questions, practical. "Do you need groceries? Has the roof leaked?" Once he asked almost in passing if I'd heard from Harper. I said no, and he made some excuse to hang up. I stopped trying to reach out. Every conversation left me feeling smaller, like I was asking for something I wasn't owed. The nights were the hardest. Sometimes I'd wake from dreams of when the house was full, birthday candles, arguments over the television, Harper's piano practice drifting down the hall. I'd sit in the dark and try to remember where things started to shift. Whether it was after Harold's funeral, or when Harper landed her first promotion, or some small moment I'd missed entirely. The pain was quiet but deep, an ache that settled in my chest and made each day feel heavier than the last. One afternoon, I saw an envelope in the mailbox, a birthday card from Zoe. She'd drawn a picture on the front, bright markers and looping letters. Inside was a short note, "Love you, Grandma. Can't wait for summer." I held the card for a long time at the kitchen table, the sun warming my hands through the window. The innocence in her words made the loss sharper, but it also reminded me what mattered. Kindness, honesty, a sense that home should be safe for everyone. There were moments I almost called Harper, ready to say I'd let the whole thing go. But each time I'd remember the letter, the forged signature, the way she'd avoided my eyes at the restaurant. I'd remember the silence on the other end of the phone when I told Lennox what had happened. I wanted to believe we could go back to the way things were, but every sign told me we couldn't. On Sunday, I went to church alone. I wore my best coat pinned on Harold's old watch and sat in the same pew we'd shared for years. The pastor spoke about forgiveness, about how grace was often hardest to extend to the people closest to us. I listened, hands folded in my lap, trying to find a space in my heart for both love and hurt. After the service, a neighbor stopped me at the door, her eyes kind but searching. "If you ever need anything, Winnie, you know where to find me." I thanked her, then walked home through the chill, passing houses where children played on the lawns, their laughter floating on the wind. At home, I stood by the window, watching the clouds move across the sky, and tried to imagine what tomorrow might bring. The weeks unfolded quietly, one after another, each day, much like the last. Rowan called with updates, patient as ever. She'd let me know the civil suit was filed, that the bank had agreed to freeze all foreclosure proceedings until the case was heard. She told me to be ready, that there would likely be pushback from Harper's side, maybe even from Lennox. I thanked her and asked if she'd ever seen a family come back together after something like this. Rowan paused, then answered that healing took time, and sometimes it meant letting go of what you thought family should be. That evening, I made tea and sat out on the porch, a blanket around my shoulders. I watched the streetlights come on one by one and let the quiet settle in. I thought about the promise I'd made to myself to see this through, to stand up for what was right, even if I had to do it alone. The weight of that promise pressed down, but there was a strength in it too. A steady kind of courage I hadn't known I still had. As the moon rose over the rooftops and the town grew still, I thought of Audrey's words, how sometimes love meant holding your ground, even when it hurt. The next part of the story hadn't revealed itself yet, but I felt the first faint stirring of change like a breeze that signals rain long before the clouds gather. In the quiet, I waited, knowing the hardest choices were still ahead, and that sometimes the only way forward was through the storm. The weeks passed slow and heavy, each day folding into the next. I spent more time in my garden hands, in the cool dirt, pulling weeds from around the roses Harold had planted so many years ago. There was comfort in the work and the feel of earth and the steady rhythm of watering, but a restlessness hummed beneath the surface, stronger with every new letter that arrived in the mail. Each envelope with the bank's logo on it made my heart thud in my chest. I opened them carefully, bracing myself for another demand or warning. But most of the time, it was only more reminders, more notices, more proof that what Harper had done would not fade away on its own. One morning, after a night of little sleep, I sat at the kitchen table with a pad of paper and a pencil. I made 2 lists, what I stood to lose and what I still had left. My house, my savings, the memory of a family that once felt whole. Against that, there was my name, my reputation, my peace of mind. I stared at the words, the column of losses longer than the column of what remained, and realized the only way forward was to stop waiting for someone else to make things right. That afternoon, Rowan called with an update. "Winnie, we've gathered enough evidence now, the loan documents, the handwriting analysis, your alibi from the clinic. We can move forward with the civil suit, and if you're ready, we can request that the court freeze any action on your house until the trial." Her voice was steady, the kind of reassurance I'd come to depend on. I asked her what would happen next, and she explained the court process. The paperwork would be filed, Harper would be served, and there would likely be a hearing. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" she asked, quieter now. "Even if it means things with your children might never go back." I didn't answer right away, but when I did, my voice felt stronger than it had in a long time. "Yes, Rowan, I'm sure." A few days later, the air in the house felt different. I'd spent the morning sorting through old photographs, gathering up the ones that meant the most to me: family trips to Lake Erie, Christmas mornings in pajamas, Harold holding Zoe on his knee. I placed the pictures on the mantel, each one a small promise to myself that I wouldn't let what was happening now erase everything we'd been. When the phone rang that afternoon, I recognized the number. It was Harper. She didn't waste time with small talk. "Mom, we need to meet. I want to come by tonight." I agreed, not sure what I expected. That evening she arrived looking tired and drawn, a stranger's wariness in her eyes. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, fingers tight around her coffee mug. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why can't you just let it go?" I told her the truth. I couldn't let it go, not after everything she'd done, not when my home and my future were at risk. Harper's shoulders stiffened. She insisted it wasn't her fault, that she never meant for any of this to happen, that Frank had pushed her into it, that it was only ever supposed to be temporary. I listened, but she didn't look me in the eye. When she finished, there was a long silence. I pushed the papers across the table, the letters, the loan documents, the proof of my alibi. She barely glanced at them. "I just wanted a better life for my family," she said, finally, her voice tight with frustration. "I didn't think you'd ever find out." I watched her trying to find the girl I'd raised in the woman before me. The room felt colder than before. After she left, I sat alone in the kitchen, the clock on the wall ticking out the empty minutes. I realized nothing about this conversation had made the pain any easier to bear. If anything, it cut a little deeper. I called Rowan, told her I was ready to go forward, ready to do whatever it took to see this through. The next morning, as I tidied the living room, my phone buzzed. It was Audrey, her voice brisk and bright. "Winnie, my niece Paige is working a catering job this weekend. You'll never guess where Harper's new house at Lakeview Terrace. Big party, 40 guests. She didn't even invite you." I thanked Audrey for telling me. My mind spun at the thought Harper celebrating in that house, toasting friends in rooms bought with my name and my sacrifice, and not a single word to me. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the party in my mind, picturing Harper greeting guests, Zoe twirling in a new dress, the sound of laughter spilling out through open windows. The anger simmered low in my stomach, but it was the shame that stung the most, knowing my own daughter could go on as if nothing had happened, as if I were invisible, as if all this was just some minor inconvenience to be brushed aside. By the time the sun rose, my mind was made up. I called Rowan, my voice steady, even as my hands shook. "If Harper is throwing a party in that house, then she can be served there. I want her to know I'm not backing down." Rowan agreed, explaining how the bailiff could deliver the official notice in person. "It will cause a scene, Winnie. Are you prepared for that?" I said yes. I'd been quiet too long. On the day of the party, I dressed carefully, smoothing the navy dress I saved for special occasions. I met Rowan and the bailiff, Mr. Nash, at a little cafe near Lakeview Terrace. Rowan explained the plan. I could enter with the bailiff or wait outside. I thought about what it would mean to walk into that house to see Harper's face, to stand tall in front of friends and strangers. "I'll go in with Mr. Nash," I decided. It felt important to be seen to show that I would not be swept aside. The walk to the house was short, but it felt longer. I looked up at the bright, perfect windows, the new cars in the driveway, the sound of music and laughter spilling through the open door. When the catering staff ushered us inside, I kept my back straight, my hands folded in front of me. Mr. Nash moved through the crowd with quiet authority, found Harper near the living room window, and delivered the documents. She stared at the bailiff at me, her face turning pale as she realized what was happening. The room went silent. All eyes were on us. Frank tried to intervene, suggesting we talk privately, but I told him there was nothing left to say in private. I looked at Harper, then at the guests, and told them plainly the house was bought with my name, my credit, my risk, without my knowledge or consent. Harper sputtered, tried to claim I'd agreed, but I stood my ground. For the first time in a long while, I felt something like peace. When it was done, I turned and walked out of that house. The sky was clear, a soft gold over the water. I didn't look back. That evening, the phone rang and rang neighbors, friends, people wanting to know what had happened. I let most of the calls go to voicemail, not ready to retell the story or explain myself. I sat with a cup of tea by the kitchen window, watching the moon rise above the quiet street, knowing the hardest part was still ahead. The world had changed, and so had I. Tomorrow, I would begin again, carrying both the pain and the promise that came with standing up for myself. After the night of Harper's party, the story seemed to spill across every corner of town. The house on Lakeview Terrace, once just another symbol of quiet privilege, was now whispered about in the grocery aisles and church parking lots. Each time the phone rang, it was another friend or neighbor wanting to know the truth, their voices slipping between concern and curiosity. I answered as briefly as I could, never offering more than I had to. There was nothing left to explain. Days blurred together in a steady routine. I woke early, swept the kitchen, tidied the porch, watered the pots of petunias lined up by the front steps. I checked the mailbox with a practiced caution, never sure what the next envelope would hold. Some mornings, I caught my reflection in the window, and wondered who I was becoming. For years, I had tried to keep the peace, smoothing over rough edges, keeping family business private. Now my world felt stripped down to its essentials. One small house, a stack of documents on the table, and the knowledge that I could not turn away from what was happening. Rowan called to say the suit had been filed and that Harper would have 21 days to answer the court. "She'll try to contact you," Rowan said, her voice low and clear. "Be ready for it. She may try to persuade you to drop the case." I thanked her and spent that evening preparing myself for whatever came next. I made tea, straightened my papers, tried to recall the feeling of quiet resolve I'd carried into that house the night of the party. 3 days later, Harper called. I recognized her number, but let it ring. On the 4th attempt, I answered. She sounded different, no hint of the polished certainty she once wore like a shield. "Mom, can I come over?" she asked. "I need to talk." She arrived not long after, standing uncertain in the doorway, a shadow of the girl I remembered. She didn't bring Zoe. She sat at my kitchen table, hands wrapped around her mug, eyes fixed on a spot just beyond my shoulder. Harper spoke quietly, almost to herself. She told me about the lawyer she'd hired, how he'd explained that the evidence against her was overwhelming. She said, "He thinks we should settle, avoid a trial, keep it out of the papers." I listened. She offered to take on the loan herself, to pay every dollar and every penalty to give me compensation. All she asked was that I drop the lawsuit and not go to the police. Her words were rehearsed, delivered with the urgency of someone hoping to outrun what was coming. I asked her about the house. She said she and Frank would have to sell it, that they could never afford the payments now, not after what had happened. She looked at me for the first time, then her face thin and drawn. "I'm sorry, Mom. I just wanted a better life. I didn't mean for you to get hurt." I listened for a sign of regret, of understanding. Instead, I heard the fear for her job, her marriage, her future. I told her I needed time to think. She nodded, left her mug in the sink, and slipped out the door as quietly as she'd arrived. The following morning, Lennox showed up without warning. He didn't sit. He stood in the middle of the living room, hands shoved deep in his pockets, anger simmering in his voice. "This has gone far enough, Mom. You're destroying the family. Harper's lost her house. Frank's furious. Everyone's talking." I waited for him to say more. He circled the room, pointing to pictures on the wall, his own childhood frozen in black and white. "We're your children. You're supposed to help us, not drag us through court. Just drop the suit. Please." I told him calmly that what Harper had done was wrong, and that silence was no longer an option. He shook his head, called me stubborn, then left, slamming the screen door behind him. I stood alone in the hallway, the sound of Lennox's footsteps echoing down the walk. For a long moment, I stared at the spot where he'd stood, trying to remember the last time my son had looked at me with anything other than impatience or disappointment. I picked up the photos he'd pointed to and dusted them with my sleeve. The faces looked back at me, innocent, unknowing. That afternoon, I called Rowan to tell her about Harper's offer. She listened carefully, then said, "It's a fair settlement. You'd be protected, released from the debt, and compensated. But you should know if you go to trial, the court will almost certainly rule in your favor." Harper would lose the house, and there could be legal consequences for her beyond money. I thanked her. I promised to consider it, but my mind was restless. Was this about punishment or something deeper? Was I looking for an apology I'd never receive, or simply trying to remind myself and my children that I was still here, still worthy of respect? I spent that night turning the offer over in my mind. I thought of Zoe, of the way her voice had sounded in that birthday card, cheerful and untouched by all this adult pain. I thought of Harper as a little girl of Lennox before his voice grew sharp. The ache was real, but so was the clarity I could not go back to being silent. By morning, my answer was clear. I called Rowan and told her I wanted to continue to trial. If Harper was truly sorry, she would face what she had done. The law would decide, not a private arrangement in a quiet kitchen. Rowan's voice was warm, steady. "I'll move forward, Winnie. I'm proud of you." A storm rolled in that afternoon, thunder rumbling over the lake. I watched the rain streak the windows, watched the street grow slick and empty. It felt like the world was waiting, holding its breath. When the storm passed, I went outside and walked through the garden, letting the wet grass soak my shoes. Each step felt new, different from the careful movements of the past few months. There was pain, yes, but there was also something like relief, a lifting of the weight I'd carried for far too long. As the evening settled in, Audrey called. Her voice was bright as always, but I could hear the worry underneath. She told me that Frank had left Harper, that Zoe was staying with her mother, but would likely spend more time with her father now. "You didn't do this," Winnie Audrey said. "You just stood up for yourself. Sometimes that's the hardest thing." I thanked her and promised to call soon. When the call ended, I sat at the kitchen table and looked out at the dusk. I felt the ache of all I'd lost, but I also felt a small, steady pride. I would see this through wherever it led. I was no longer waiting for someone else to rescue me or make the decisions for me. In the stillness, I realized the next step was coming court testimony and the last reckoning. I set my alarm for the morning and told myself quietly that whatever happened next, I would not regret having spoken the truth. The morning of the court hearing arrived cool and gray, with a thin mist hanging just above the street. I dressed with care, choosing my navy skirt and a cream blouse, nothing fancy, but pressed and neat the way I was raised to show up for important things. I slipped on my old raincoat, picked up the folder Rowan had helped me organize, and locked the door behind me. My hands didn't tremble, not that I could feel, but I kept glancing at my reflection in the entryway mirror, checking that my hair was smooth, that I hadn't left anything behind. The courthouse in our small town sits 2 blocks from the old post office, right across from the bakery where Harold used to buy jelly donuts for Sunday mornings. As I climbed the steps, I noticed the benches lined with planters, petunias, and Dusty Miller blooming despite the cold. Rowan met me at the entrance, holding a thermos of coffee and a reassuring smile. "We're ready, Winnie," she said quietly. "Whatever happens today, you've already done the hardest part." Inside the courtroom was brighter than I remembered sunlight pushing through tall windows, bouncing off polished wood. People spoke in low voices, and I found my seat near the front, setting the folder gently in my lap. Harper entered a few minutes later, flanked by her attorney. She didn't look at me, just kept her eyes on the floor. Lennox slid in behind her, keeping his distance. The judge was a small, dignified woman with silver hair pinned back neatly. She called the session to order, her voice carrying a weight of calm authority. The lawyers spoke first. Harper's attorney argued that I'd given my consent, that all families have their misunderstandings, that this was just a case of confusion between relatives. Rowan stood and spoke steadily, laying out the evidence, the forged signature, my medical records showing I was at St. Elizabeth's when the loan was signed, the statements from the bank and real estate agent. She didn't raise her voice, didn't show anger, just let the facts settle in the quiet room. I listened as if hearing my own story from far away. When it came time to speak, I stood and gave my statement. I told the judge about the letter from the bank, about Harper's new car, and the house I'd never seen. I described the way my children's voices changed when I tried to talk about the loan, how I realized my name had been used for something I never agreed to. I spoke about what it meant to live in the house Harold and I had built, how I'd tried to be a mother who supported her children, but never expected to be betrayed like this. The judge listened closely, nodding once in a while, her hands folded on the bench. When the lawyers finished, the judge looked between me and Harper. She spoke carefully, reminding us that the evidence was clear fraud, and forgery were not simply family disagreements, but serious matters under the law. But she also acknowledged that families can be complicated, that sometimes what's legal and what's right feel tangled together. She suggested we take a week to reconsider a settlement and adjourned the session. I gathered my things slowly, the words still echoing in my ears. In the hallway outside, Harper approached me. She looked tired, her face drawn and pale. "Mommy, please let's just settle this," she said quietly. "You see what's coming. I could lose everything, my job, my reputation. Think about Zoe. She'd be the daughter of a criminal." I heard the fear in her voice, but not remorse. She wanted to avoid the fallout, not face what she'd done. I told her softly, "You should have thought about Zoe before you did this." She flinched, eyes flashing with anger and pain. "Are you just trying to prove you're right? Is this revenge for every time I argued with you?" I shook my head. "No, Harper. I want you to understand that choices have consequences. I want justice, not revenge." She looked at me for a long moment, then turned and walked away, her shoulders stiff. Lennox didn't say a word as he left. I watched them disappear through the glass doors, the click of Harper's heels fading into the quiet. My heart ached, but there was a clarity to it now. A line had been drawn, and I couldn't step back over it. Rowan joined me as I waited for my ride. She touched my arm lightly, offering reassurance without words. "You did well today, Winnie. Whatever happens next, you spoke your truth." We stood in silence for a moment, listening to the soft hum of voices in the corridor. That evening, I returned home to a house that felt unchanged and yet completely different. I made a simple supper, turned on the lamp by Harold's chair, and tried to read though my eyes kept drifting to the clock. I thought about what the judge had said about how families can become unrecognizable to themselves. I thought about Zoe, about the future. I hoped she'd have one, where she'd understand the difference between love and enabling, between kindness and letting yourself be trampled. I wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but I knew the next chapter was coming soon. Night settled in quiet and steady. I washed the dishes, locked the doors, and stood by the window a long time watching the streetlights flicker on across the block. I let myself hope, just for a moment, that there could still be something worth saving on the other side of all this. As the house grew dark and still, I set my alarm for morning and promised myself I would not look away, no matter what the verdict might bring. The last part of the story was still waiting a reckoning, and perhaps a measure of peace I had not expected to find. The day the verdict was announced, the courthouse felt colder than before. I woke early, made a small pot of oatmeal, and sat quietly at my kitchen table, listening to the steady ticking of the wall clock. The drive into town passed in a haze, the streets washed in morning light, every intersection familiar but tinged with a new weight. I parked by the curb, walked slowly up the courthouse steps, and paused at the doors just long enough to steady my breath. Inside, the courtroom was already filling up. Rowan sat beside me, calm, and prepared her papers arranged in careful stacks. Across the aisle, Harper sat with her attorney, shoulders drawn and eyes fixed straight ahead. Lennox slipped in behind her, not meeting my gaze. The judge took her place and called the session to order. The room grew still, the air carrying that peculiar hush that falls when a family's fate hangs in the balance. The judge spoke first, her voice measured and deliberate. She laid out the evidence, each document, each piece of testimony, the forged signature, the medical records showing my alibi. the tangled trail of money from the loan to the house on Lakeview Terrace. She acknowledged the pain behind the facts, the complicated threads of family loyalty and betrayal. When she delivered her ruling, her words were clear and final. The loan agreement in my name was declared null and void. The bank was ordered to cancel my obligations, and Harper was required to pay compensation for moral damages. For a moment, the only sound was the rustling of papers and the low shuffle of chairs. I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness, as if something vital had been set right, and yet the cost lingered. Harper rose, gathering her things without a word, her face pale and tight. Lennox left with her, not sparing a glance in my direction. I remained in my seat, letting the reality sink in. After the hearing, Rowan offered a gentle smile and a warm handshake. "It's over, Winnie." The court saw the truth. I nodded, barely trusting myself to speak. The courthouse emptied out, leaving behind an echo of voices and the faint smell of floor polish and old wood. I walked back to my car, slowly, the late morning sun just beginning to warm the hood. Over the next few days, word of the ruling spread quickly through town. Neighbors called with quiet words of support, some expressing surprise, others sharing their own stories of family troubles. I answered their calls with as much grace as I could manage, never offering more detail than necessary. Audrey came by often, sometimes with fresh muffins, sometimes with nothing but her company. We would sit together on my back porch, letting the conversation drift from flowers to old memories and back again. One afternoon, as rain tapped softly against the windows, I received a call from Rowan. The bank had decided not to pursue criminal charges, choosing instead to seize the house to cover the loan. Harper and Zoe would need to move. Frank had already filed for divorce, and Lennox's family wanted nothing more to do with me. My world grew quieter, the circle of people in it shrinking down to a precious few. A week later, Harper called. Her voice was tired, the edges worn thin. She asked to see me, and I agreed. She arrived late in the afternoon, dressed simply, no trace of her old confidence. We sat at the kitchen table, cups of tea cooling between us. "Mom, I'm sorry," she said, but the words felt heavy, as if she struggled to lift them. "I know I hurt you. I know what I did was wrong." I listened, hearing both her regret and her fear for the future. She spoke of selling the house, starting over, trying to mend what she could for Zoe's sake. There was no request for forgiveness, only the quiet acceptance that things would not go back to how they were. When she left, I watched her drive away, her figure framed by the late afternoon light. I sat in my living room until dusk, the house settling into a new kind of stillness. I thought about all that had happened: the trial, the family ruptures, the ways trust can be broken and rebuilt, even if the shape of things never quite returns to what it once was. Later that evening, I called Audrey, and we spoke quietly for a long time, neither of us rushing to fill the silence. I realized then that while justice had come, the cost was real. My children and grandchildren were gone from my daily life. The house felt larger, quieter, but I moved through it with a sense of dignity I hadn't known before. The hardest truths had been spoken, the final judgment given, and there was nothing left but to find my way forward. As the moon rose and shadows stretched across the yard, I turned off the lights and climbed the stairs. My heart was heavy, but underneath the sorrow was a quiet strength. I knew that in the days ahead, I would have to learn how to live for myself, not for the approval of children who had chosen their own paths, but for the sake of my own peace. The story was not quite over yet, but for the first time in a long while, I believed there was hope in the space that remained. The weeks after the trial passed quietly each day, settling into a rhythm I hadn't known in years. Mornings began with sunlight on my kitchen table, the world outside softened by the gentle hush of early spring. Audrey came by often, her laughter filling the rooms that once felt so empty. We took walks through the neighborhood, learning to see familiar streets with new eyes. I found comfort in the steady rituals of watering my garden, baking a simple loaf of bread, or sharing an afternoon pot of tea with someone who listened without judgment. I saw less and less of Harper and Lennox. Their absence was an ache I carried quietly, but it was no longer sharp. Every now and then I would hear about them through friends or neighbors, Harper settling into a small apartment with Zoe Lennox moving his family out of town. It hurt to know my grandchildren were growing up out of reach, but I let go of the hope that things might return to how they were. In its place, I found something gentler acceptance and a peace I hadn't felt in a long time. With the settlement from the court and a small offer from the bank, I finally did something for myself. Audrey and I signed up for computer classes at the community center, laughing at our own clumsy attempts to keep up with the younger folks. We started planning a trip somewhere neither of us had ever been, just for the joy of it. For the first time in decades, I felt free to imagine a future built on my own choices. Looking back, I see now that the hardest part was not losing the house or the money, but standing up for my own worth when it felt like no one else could see it. I spent a lifetime believing that love meant sacrifice, that it was my place to endure and forgive. But sometimes loving your children means letting them face the consequences of their own actions, even when it breaks your heart. Justice, I learned, is not always about punishment. Sometimes it's about reclaiming your dignity, refusing to disappear even when others are determined to look past you. I still have days when the loneliness creeps in, when memories tug at the edges of my peace. But more often now, I wake up grateful for the small freedoms I fought to keep. I find meaning in the kindness of a neighbor, a fresh bloom in my garden, or the quiet satisfaction of learning something new. The story that began with betrayal did not end in bitterness. Instead, it became a lesson in resilience and a reminder that every life, no matter how overlooked, has value and a voice worth defending. If you've listened this far, thank you for sharing a bit of your day with me. Maybe you faced something similar, or maybe you just needed to know you're not alone. I hope you'll leave a comment, share your own story, or simply remember that it's never too late to stand up for yourself and begin again. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, you're always welcome to join me next time.